It's the fateful day of October 25, 1415, a day that would become legendary in English history. The stage is set near the town of Agincourt in northern France, and the 100 Years' War is in full swing. On this day, the English and French armies would clash in a battle that would go down in history as the Battle of Agincourt, forever etching its name into the annals of epic victories. The English, facing a daunting numerical disadvantage, were undeterred. They had resumed hostilities in 1415 after peace talks with the French had crumbled to dust. As they marched on, sickness ravaged their ranks, and their numbers dwindled. Their destination was the English stronghold of Calais, but fate had other plans. Blocking their path was a formidable French force, vastly outnumbering the English. King Henry V of England, a warrior at heart, stood at the forefront of his troops, ready for the impending clash. On the opposing side, King Charles VI of France was incapacitated by mental illness, leaving the French command in the hands of Constable Charles d'Albret and other prominent nobles of the Armagnac faction. What made this battle truly extraordinary was the English longbow, a weapon that would go down in history. Nearly 80% of Henry's army consisted of English and Welsh archers, their bows poised for battle. William Harrington, the official standard-bearer of England, carried Henry's standard, a symbol of their unwavering resolve. The Battle of Agincourt would become one of England's most celebrated triumphs, joining the ranks of other historic victories like the Battle of Crécy, 1346, and the Battle of Poitiers, 1356. It was a testament to the indomitable human spirit, where a vastly outnumbered force emerged victorious, defying all odds. This epic battle continues to captivate the imagination of scholars and the general public alike, even in the modern day. It served as the backdrop for William Shakespeare's iconic play, Henry V, penned in 1599, immortalizing the valor and determination displayed on that historic day. The Battle of Agincourt is no mere legend, it's well documented in at least 7 contemporary accounts, with 3 of them authored by eyewitnesses. The general location of the battle remains undisputed, and even after 6 centuries, the battlefield retains much of its original character. However, the exact battlefield's location has sparked debates among historians due to a lack of archaeological evidence. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Henry summoned the heralds from both armies, along with the principal French herald Montjoie, to settle on a name for this historic clash. Agincourt, named after the nearest fortified place, was the chosen moniker. Among the most frequently cited accounts are those from Burgundian sources, including Jean Lefebvre de Saint-Remy, who was present at the battle, and Enguerrand de Monstrelet. The English perspective comes from the anonymous author of the Hester Henrici Quinty, believed to be a chaplain in the king's household, who would have witnessed the battle from the baggage train. A recent re-evaluation of Henry's strategy during the Agincourt campaign incorporates these accounts, suggesting that war was viewed as a legal means to resolve the dispute over claims to the French throne. Before the Battle of Agincourt came to pass, the stage was set by years of political maneuvering and diplomatic negotiations. Henry V had launched his invasion of France after diplomatic efforts with the French had faltered. His claim to the French throne, harking back to his great-grandfather Edward III of England, stood at the center of this conflict. However, in practice, English monarchs were often willing to relinquish this claim if France recognized English sovereignty over Aquitaine and other French territories, as stipulated in the Treaty of Bretigny. The road to war was not a direct one. In the spring of 1414, Henry convened a great council to discuss war with France, but the nobles pushed for further negotiations and a more moderate stance. In these negotiations, Henry proposed relinquishing his claim to the French throne in exchange for the French paying the outstanding ransom of 1.6 million crowns for John II, who had been captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Additionally, he demanded French recognition of English ownership of Anjou, Brittany, Flanders, Normandy, Touraine, and Aquitaine. Henry's personal life was also woven into these negotiations. He sought to marry Catherine, the young daughter of Charles VI of France, with a dowry of 2 million crowns. The French countered with a more modest offer, marriage with Catherine, a dowry of 600,000 crowns, and an enlarged Aquitaine. Negotiations reached an impasse, and by 1415, The English Parliament granted Henry a double subsidy, essentially a tax rate twice the norm, to fund his quest to reclaim his French inheritance. By April 19, 1415, Henry once again sought the Great Council's approval for war, and this time, they relented. Henry's army made landfall in northern France on August 13, 1415, aboard a massive fleet. While legends speak of 1,500 ships, historical evidence suggests a much smaller number. Notably, among Henry's forces were his royal physician and a small group of surgeons, indicating the significance of medical care during this campaign. Their initial objective was the port of Harfleur, which they besieged. However, the siege was protracted, and the English army, beset by diseases, did not leave until October 8. As the campaign season neared its end and the English suffered heavy casualties, Henry decided on a daring maneuver. Instead of retreating directly to England for the winter, he led his weary troops on a march through Normandy to the English stronghold of Calais. His presence in this territory, with an army in tow, was intended to assert his right to rule in the duchy and provoke the Dauphin, who had not responded to Henry's challenge to combat at Harfleur. During the siege of Harfleur, the French had raised an army around Rouen. This army, organized not through the traditional feudal system but through a structure akin to the English system, aimed to muster 9,000 troops. However, they were unable to reach Harfleur in time to lift the siege. As Henry moved northward, the French shadowed his army and issued a call to local nobles, known as the Semence des Nobles, urging them to join their forces. By October 24, both armies stood ready for battle, but the French hesitated, hoping for reinforcements. That night, with the two armies camped on open ground, negotiations began as a delay tactic. However, Henry was determined to fight, even though his battle-weary army was not in optimal condition. Despite their depleted ranks, sickness, and an enemy force of well-equipped French men-at-arms, the English took the initiative and advanced, initiating a battle that Henry would have preferred to avoid. It was a battle fought under dire circumstances, echoing the victories at Crécy and other famous longbow battles. The English faced severe hardships, including hunger, a grueling march of 260 miles in just 2.5 weeks, and the looming presence of the French, blocking their path to the safety of Calais. As the sun rose on that fateful day, the battlefield remained shrouded in uncertainty. The exact location of the impending clash was a mystery. Some believed it to be the narrow strip of land between the woods of Troncourt and Agincourt, close to the modern village of Agincourt. However, the absence of archaeological evidence at this traditional site cast doubt, leading some to suggest an alternate location west of Agincourt. On the morning of October 25, 1415, King Henry V and his English army, consisting of approximately 1,500 men-at-arms and 7,000 longbowmen, took their positions across a 750-yard stretch of land. The army was strategically divided into three groups: the right wing, led by Edward, Duke of York; the center, where King Henry himself stood at the helm; and the left wing, under the experienced Baron Thomas Camoys. Overseeing the archers was Sir Thomas Erpingham, another seasoned veteran. The English battle formation was likely what they had employed before: longbowmen on the flanks with men-at-arms and knights in the center. There may have been archers interspersed within the center ranks. Shoulder to shoulder, the English men-at-arms, clad in plate and mail, formed a formidable line of defense. To deter cavalry charges, the English and Welsh archers planted pointed wooden stakes, known as palings, into the ground at an angle. In the hours leading up to battle, the English soldiers made their confessions, a customary prelude to the impending violence. King Henry, however, had more in mind than just spiritual preparation. Fearful of surprise attacks and determined to keep his troops focused, he issued a strict order: silence must reign among his ranks throughout the night before the battle, under the penalty of having an ear severed. His message was clear: he would rather die on this battlefield than face capture and ransom. Henry then delivered a rousing speech, rallying his troops with the conviction of their cause and reminding them of England's glorious victories over the French in the past. As the Burgundian sources recount, he concluded his speech by revealing a grim rumor: the French had supposedly boasted of cutting off 2 fingers from the right hand of every English archer to prevent them from ever drawing a longbow again. While the veracity of this claim remains a subject of debate, one thing was certain: The fate of soldiers who couldn't be ransomed on the battlefield was rarely a pleasant one. Across the field, the French forces assembled, a formidable army of 10,000 men at arms, along with some 4,000 to 5,000 footmen, including archers, crossbowmen, and shield-bearers, amounting to a total of 14,000 to 15,000 men. Each man at arms was accompanied by a gros valet, an armed servant, potentially swelling their ranks by another 10,000 combatants, although some historians dispute this figure. The French formation consisted of two main groups or battles, a vanguard at the front and a main battle behind it. Both were primarily composed of men at arms fighting on foot, flanked by additional men at arms on each wing. There was also an elite cavalry unit with the specific task of breaking the English archers' formation, clearing the path for the infantry to advance. Another smaller mounted force planned to attack the rear of the English army, targeting the baggage and servants. Eager for glory and valuable ransoms, many lords and noblemen had secured positions in the front lines. This resulted in the majority of men at arms forming a densely packed front line, while other troops were relegated to the rear due to limited space. The archers and crossbowmen, originally intended to be positioned with the infantry wings, were now placed behind them. In response to the lack of space, a third battle, the rearguard, was formed. This group was mounted on horseback and primarily composed of the varlets, armed servants, mounted on horses belonging to the men fighting on foot ahead. The vanguard and main battle of the French forces numbered around 4,800 and 3,000 men at arms, respectively. Both were arranged in tightly packed formations, with approximately 16 ranks each, positioned at a bowshot's length from one another. Leading nobles, including Albert and Boucicaut, were stationed in the vanguard, while the Dukes of Alençon and Bar commanded the main battle. To disperse the English archers, a cavalry unit of 800 to 1,200 elite men at arms was evenly distributed between both flanks of the vanguard, standing slightly forward like horns. Another 200 mounted men at arms were designated to attack the English rear. For the rest of the army, which was inadequately deployed, a rearguard was formed. This group, leaderless and serving as a kind of dumping ground for surplus troops, would follow on horseback and mainly comprised varlets riding the horses of the footmen ahead. Yet, it was the battlefield itself that would play a pivotal role in determining the battle's outcome. The recently ploughed terrain, flanked by dense woodland, favored the English. Its narrowness, combined with the thick mud caused by recent heavy rain, posed a significant challenge for the French knights. This muddy ground would prove particularly exhausting to traverse while clad in full plate armor. As the battle unfolded, accounts describe the French initially engaging the English men at arms, only to be assailed from the sides by the relentless longbowmen as the melee intensified. The English account in the Hester on Risi paints a vivid picture of the chaos, for when some of them, killed when battle was first joined, fall at the front, so great was the undisciplined violence and pressure of the mass of men behind them that the living fell on top of the dead, and others falling on top of the living were killed as well. Although the French initially pushed the English back, they became so densely packed that they struggled to wield their weapons effectively. The French monk of Street, Denis noted, their vanguard, composed of about 5,000 men, found itself at first so tightly packed that those who were in the third rank could scarcely use their swords. Similar observations were made in the Burgundian sources. The treacherous terrain, compounded by the deep, soft mud, proved particularly advantageous for the English forces. Once knocked to the ground, the heavily armored French knights found it incredibly challenging to rise and rejoin the melee. In fact, some knights, burdened by their armor, met a watery end as they struggled to stand in their helmets, forever sealing their fate in the annals of history. On that crisp October morning, the French awaited reinforcements. The Duke of Brabant, with around 2,000 men, the Duke of Anjou, commanding roughly 600 troops, and the Duke of Brittany, leading a formidable 6,000-strong contingent, were all en route to bolster the French ranks. For the first 3 hours after sunrise, an eerie stillness hung over the battlefield. The wisdom of the time dictated that in face-to-face confrontations, it was those who stood their ground and held firm who emerged victorious. The French, confident that additional forces would soon join them, were content to bide their time. Some even speculated that the English might flee upon realizing the overwhelming number of French princes they were up against. However, Henry's troops were far from battle-ready. They were weary, drained by hunger, illness, and a grueling retreat. Henry's initial intention was to position his army defensively, taking advantage of their exhaustion. But before they could adopt this posture, they had to halt their retreat, engage the French, and establish a defensive line. To do this, they pulled out of their chosen location, advanced, and then repositioned themselves with long sharpened wooden stakes pointing menacingly toward the enemy. These stakes would prove crucial in protecting the longbowmen from devastating cavalry charges. This use of stakes was an innovation for the English. In previous battles, such as the Battle of Crécy, archers had relied on pits and other obstacles for protection. The terrain's tight confines hampered the French's planned deployment. Initially, the French strategy had positioned archers and crossbowmen in front of their men-at-arms. A cavalry force was poised at the rear, ready to fall upon the archers and use their force to break them. However, in the actual battle, the archers and crossbowmen were placed behind and to the sides of the men-at-arms. Their role seemed limited, possibly confined to an initial volley of arrows at the battle's outset. As for the cavalry force, it charged only after the English's initial arrow barrage. Whether this delay stemmed from a hope that the English would launch a frontal assault, or whether the French mounted knights simply failed to respond swiftly to the English advance, remains unclear. French chroniclers do agree that when the charge finally came, it lacked the expected numbers. Some knights had apparently wandered away to warm themselves, while others casually walked or attended to their horses. The ill-fated French cavalry charged headlong towards the longbowmen, a disastrous endeavor. The French knights found themselves unable to outflank the archers due to the encroaching woodland, and the pointed stakes formed an impenetrable barrier. John Keegan argues that the longbow's main impact on this charge was the injuries inflicted on the horses. These creatures, armored only on the head, became uncontrollable when struck in the back or flank by the long-range, high-elevation shots fired as the charge began. The cavalry's charge and subsequent retreat churned up the already muddy terrain between the French and English forces. A contemporary account by a monk from St. Denis, as quoted by Juliet Barker, vividly describes how wounded and panicked horses galloped through the advancing infantry, scattering and trampling them in their frantic flight from the battlefield. Undeterred, the French men-at-arms in their splendid plate armor pushed forward through the relentless hail of English arrow fire. They had complete suits of plate, which rendered shields unnecessary. However, accounts vary regarding the effectiveness of the English longbows against this armor. Modern tests and contemporary accounts suggest that arrows couldn't penetrate high-quality steel armor, which had become accessible to knights and men-at-arms of modest means by the mid-14th century. Some historians contend that longbows could pierce wrought iron armor at close range and penetrate the thinner armor on limbs even at distances of 220 yards, 200 meters. The consensus is that a knight in top-quality steel armor would have been impervious to arrows striking the breastplate or helmet. However, shots to the limbs, especially at close range, posed a genuine threat. In an effort to shield themselves from arrows, the French lowered their visors and bent their helmeted heads to avoid facial hits, as the eye and air holes in their helmets were vulnerable points. This posture restricted their breathing and vision. Moreover, they had to traverse several hundred yards through the mire, weighed down by armor that typically exceeded 50 to 60 pounds, 23 to 27 kilograms, collecting sticky clay as they went. They also had to navigate around or over fallen comrades. The surviving French men-at-arms eventually reached the English front line and began pushing it back. Longbowmen on the flanks continued to shoot at point-blank range. When the archers ran out of arrows, they discarded their bows and, wielding hatchets, swords, and the mallets they had used to secure their stakes, launched a ferocious assault on the now disorganized, fatigued, and wounded French men-at-arms massed before them. The French struggled to withstand the onslaught of the lightly armored longbowmen, who, unburdened by the mud and heavy armor, surged forward. The relentless barrage of arrows, combined with the arduous slog through the muck, the heat and stifling confinement of their visors, and the crush of comrades, left the French men-at-arms barely able to lift their weapons when they finally clashed with the English line. As the melee intensified, the French second line joined the fray, but they too were engulfed. The narrow terrain prevented the additional troops from being utilized effectively. Many historians believe that those in the rear of the densely packed French formation unknowingly hindered the maneuverability of those in the front, inadvertently pushing them into the English formation bristling with lethal lances. After the initial wave of attack, the French found themselves fighting over and atop the fallen bodies of their compatriots. In the chaotic crush of thousands of men, many are believed to have suffocated in their armor. This grim fate, described in multiple sources, had also been documented in other battles. The French men-at-arms, prisoners or casualties, numbered in the thousands. The combat raged for approximately 3 hours, during which King Henry himself fought with unwavering valor. Upon hearing that his youngest brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had been wounded in the groin, Henry took his household guard and stood protectively over him in the front ranks, only leaving once Humphrey could be safely removed from the battlefield. Henry himself sustained a blow to the head, which dislodged a piece of the crown that adorned his helmet. The dust had settled, and the field of Agincourt bore witness to a catastrophe of immense proportions. The French had suffered a shattering defeat. Around 6,000 of their valiant soldiers lay lifeless upon the earth, their names etched into history as a roll call of military and political leaders from a bygone era. This somber list included an astonishing 90 to 120 great lords and bannerets who had met their demise, among them 3 dukes, Alençon, Bar, and Brabant, 9 counts, and 1 viscount, Puisaye, even an archbishop. France had been stripped of its constable, Albret, an admiral, the Lord of Dompierre, the master of crossbowmen, David de Rambaz, along with his 3 sons, the master of the royal household, Guichard Dauphin, and the Prevot of the Marshals. Among the fallen were 3,069 knights and squires, while at least 2,600 more lay unidentified, lacking coats of arms to distinguish them. Entire noble families had been extinguished in the male line, and in some regions, an entire generation of landed nobility was obliterated. The bailiffs of 9 major northern towns had perished, often along with their sons, relatives, and supporters. In the words of historian Juliet Barker, the battle had cut a great swath through the natural leaders of French society in Artois, Ponthieu, Normandy, Picardy. The number of prisoners taken in the aftermath ranged from 700 to 2,200. Among the captive elite were the Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon, the Counts of Eu, Vendôme, Richemont, brother of the Duke of Brittany and stepbrother of Henry V, and the esteemed Marshal Jean de Maine. English losses, although significantly lower, were still felt deeply. While numerous English sources report casualties in the double digits, historical records confirm at least 112 Englishmen who fell in the heat of battle. Monstrelet, another chronicler of the time, estimated 600 English fatalities, including prominent figures such as the Duke of York, the young Earl of Suffolk, and the Welsh esquire David Gam. Jean de Wavrin, a knight who fought on the French side, asserted that English fatalities numbered 1,600, encompassing men of all ranks. Although the victory was militarily decisive, its immediate impact was more nuanced. Henry's priority was to return to England, which he accomplished on November 16, greeted by triumphant celebrations in London on the 23rd. His return was that of a conquering hero, perceived as divinely favored by his subjects and foreign powers, excluding France. It bolstered the legitimacy of the Lancastrian monarchy and laid the groundwork for Henry's future campaigns to assert his rights and privileges in France. Yet, the aftermath of Agincourt did not lead to immediate English conquests. Henry had to deal with the delicate task of governing and securing the territories he had won. Meanwhile, the fragile truce between the warring Armagnac and Burgundian factions in France shattered completely. The bulk of the battle's fury had fallen upon the Armagnacs, and they bore the brunt of senior casualties, bearing the blame for the defeat. Seizing the opportunity, the Burgundians swiftly marshaled their armies and marched on Paris within 10 days of the battle. This disunity in France provided Henry with a precious 18-month respite to prepare both militarily and politically for a renewed campaign. When that campaign did eventually unfold, it was facilitated by the weakened political and military structures of Normandy, severely damaged by the cataclysmic events of Agincourt.